So if you guys want to take a quick break, we have one final item on for today, and it is a review of our sign ordinance and our proposed changes by Aaron and our esteemed city attorney who just received an award from the local government attorneys association.
You have 7 minutes.
I have no knowledge whatsoever. I'm not prepared.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. We'll go ahead and jump into the last item that we have here today. I'm going to give an overview of our sign ordinance and then some steps forward for some recommended changes that we're proposing to do here over the next coming months. One of the genesis of this is coming out of the U.S. Supreme Court decision in 2015, the Reed versus Town of Gilbert. It's a case out of Arizona where there were some issues with their sign ordinance, and ultimately the Supreme Court clarified what municipalities are able to do in terms of regulating signage. I'll get into some more specifics here going forward, but what we're proposing to do here is have a phased approach to make sure that our local City of Winchester ordinance meet these legal requirements, but also balances the community's communication needs, as well as the vision and goals called for within the comprehensive plan and the city's strategic plan. So basically, with a little bit of background about this Supreme Court case, it was a unanimous Supreme Court decision, and in the situation, the court held that message-based classifications in a zoning ordinance, even if they're viewpoint neutral, were considered content-based. And as a result of that, they're subject to strict scrutiny and must further compelling government interests. And basically, what all that means is, if you have to read the sign in order to regulate it, you're going to have issues with your zoning ordinance. So we need to make sure that we're restructuring our zoning ordinance in order to meet this framework that the Supreme Court has established for this type of speech regulation. So following the Supreme Court decision, staff reviewed our zoning ordinance to take a look at how that will fall in line with the decision that the Supreme Court came down with. So a majority of our permanent sign provisions appear to be consistent with that decision. They are purely tied towards proportional relationships, things like the width of the building, height, bulk requirements, things like that. Most of the issues that we've identified that we need to improve upon are within our temporary sign provisions. Those would be things where we have specific classifications about a real estate sign. That's based upon what the message of that sign is. Or construction sign, temporary advertising sign, and so forth. So what we're going to be looking to do is restructure some of that just so that we can make all this consistent with the Reed decision. So zoning staff, planning staff, and working with the city attorney, we've been trying to complete this review of our current ordinance and then come up with a draft ordinance that we can kind of take forward and get some public input on. So as we went through this process, we tried to take a step back because ultimately our sign ordinance needs to tie into our strategic plan, our city's mission and vision. So we're trying to provide a safe, vibrant, sustainable community while striving to constantly improve the quality of life here in Winchester, and also to be a beautiful, vibrant city with a historic downtown, growing economy, and great neighborhoods. So each of those factors kind of tie into where we're trying to go with this sign ordinance. The sign ordinance also ties into several aspects of the strategic plan as well, in terms of economic growth, helping accelerate revitalization of sites, making sure that incoming businesses have the opportunity to communicate with citizens and customers, updating the zoning ordinance to match the comprehensive plan, strategic plan, and the Code of Virginia is a specific action item that Council called for within Goal 2. Within Goal 3, advance the quality of life. Signage in general is something that we all just kind of take for granted, but just making sure that we have the right balance in our zoning ordinance ties into that goal as well. And then within Goal 4, continue enhancements to our land development approval process for improved customer service, and making sure that we have a zoning ordinance, and specifically a sign ordinance that's customer friendly, easy to read, is easy to administer is important and ties into that action item as well. So overall, what's the purpose of a sign ordinance? And these items are called for within our purpose statement within the proposed text amendment as well. We want to try and provide for adequate communication through signage while ensuring an attractive and a harmonious community. protecting the safety of pedestrians and motorized traffic, protecting property values and character of various neighborhoods throughout the city, and also protection of tourist corridors and historic areas. Overall, what we're trying to achieve with this is we're going to be doing a comprehensive update to the sign ordinance. It's no use just doing some changes around the margins here. If we're going to be doing some comprehensive changes, let's just take a look at the whole thing. We're going to be trying to simplify the ordinance, improve readability. Sign ordinances are probably one of the sections of the zoning ordinance that people refer to most frequently. So we want to make sure that it's something that the lay person can just pick up, read, know exactly what we're talking about, and being able to communicate back and forth about use allowances and so forth. We want to continue to implement the high standards for our corridor enhancement districts in our historic district. Those are directly tied into our tourism industry and attracting people from out of Winchester to come in and making sure they have a pleasant experience while they're here. And then also we want to try and maintain a standard of proportionality. Having standards about quantity, size, spacing, they're tied to the size of the property, the size of the structure that they're advertising, and so forth. Again, just some of the background about the purpose of these revisions. As a result of some recent court decisions that clarified how local government can craft their sign ordinances, we need to make sure that our sign regulations are content neutral. This is something that not just Winchester is facing, this is something throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia and the entire country that people have to take a step back, take a look at their ordinances and make sure that we're not having any content-based regulations in our sign ordinances. An example here, real estate signs, political signs, those are specifically defined in our zoning ordinance based upon the type of speech that they're advertising. So we just need to restructure some of that. So what we're proposing to do here within this draft ordinance, we want to make sure we're including a strong finding of purpose and intent. Now that's council outlining what the whole purpose of this ordinance is, why we have the regulations the way they are, what we're protecting, what we're encouraging, and so forth. Looking to expand the list of definitions, just make sure everybody's on the same page as to what different terms and provisions mean. And kind of the big part of what we're doing here is trying to restructure where the information is located in the sign ordinance. Right now, you kind of have to fish around a few different locations if you're trying to find all the sign provisions that are applicable to your property. So what we're doing here is trying to put everything by zoning district, permanent and temporary, just so that you can have kind of a one spot that you look in the ordinance and say, okay, here's everything that applies to my property. Again, trying to improve that readability. So just a little bit more into the methodology of what we're proposing to do. So we're trying to go away from those content-based regulations and get into content-neutral factors. These would be things like size, just what's the allowable square footage, number of signs allowed on the property, height, location, what's the physical nature of the sign? Is it attached to a building? Is it freestanding? Those types of things. What's the duration of display? Is it permanent or is it temporary? And then what type of materials are being used. So these are types of things that we can still include within our zoning ordinance. They're not content-based. They are kind of more in terms of just the structure of the sign, how long it's going to be on display, and so forth. These are just some illustrations of what we're trying to move away from in terms of just sign clutter. Just, again, some visual illustrations. So what we're looking to do is also maintain certain sign prohibitions. These would be things like inflatable signs, signs in the right-of-way in the middle, and then also signs that are set in motion by the wind or the atmosphere. So things that will limit distractions to pedestrians and motorists and help us have a more attractive and safe community. Something else that we presently don't have in our ordinance that we're looking to address, things like vehicle signs. Don't really see too many of those in Winchester, but they can be something that can be a distraction, like in this case on Maryville Avenue several years ago. Something else came up in a conversation several years ago with Chief Sanzenbacher was window signs and the community safety aspect of the police being able to see into a business and things like that. So we're looking to include some provisions about window signs and some proportionality, just to make sure that we don't have a completely opaque situation where, law enforcement can't see inside of, what's going on in the commercial business. So there'd be a little bit more restructuring and having a maximum of 25% coverage, in a storefront or glass, just to help again make sure that there's adequate visibility. Some of the challenges that we anticipate, running through with this process is trying to strike the right balance between the need to communicate and then also ensuring that the sign allowance meets the standards that we have here for Winchester. Often, as we all know, businesses want more signs. They need to be able to communicate, reach out, let people know what's going on in terms of their practices. And often we hear from citizens and residents they want to have less. So it's just trying to strike that right balance in terms of what's our community need, but also encouraging economic development, allowing for that commercial speech to take place in Winchester. As I mentioned earlier, the provisions for permanent signage are fairly consistent with the Reed decision. We don't anticipate there being too many alterations there with this draft ordinance. Most of the changes are going to be with temporary signs. We just have to move away from some of those definitions that we currently have and move more towards just size, height, and number requirements on a property versus getting into, is it a real estate sign or an advertising sign. Additionally, community buy-in, I'll touch upon that with my plan of how we recommend putting this into effect. Just making sure that everybody has equal opportunity to understand and enforcement. It's always a challenge when it comes to temporary signs. Staff is recommending utilization of a temporary sign permit. I know this is something that council's debated in the past, but that would be something, at least tentatively, that we have within this draft ordinance. And then we just need to make sure that we have effective public education following the adoption of whatever ordinance the council chooses to, just to make sure that everybody's aware of what these revised community standards will be. Because especially when it comes to temporary signs, it is going to be an adjustment from what we presently have in Winchester. In terms of steps forward, this is a kind of a draft plan is how I see us moving forward. Included within the agenda materials that you have today is a draft ordinance that we've been working on. And I think that's probably 90–95% complete. So we look to wrap it up here within the next month or so. And then following from that, reach out, kind of form some community stakeholder groups, make sure that some of our different representatives throughout Winchester have the ability to take a look at what we have, provide some input before we take this through the public review process. That way we can make sure we get some of that community buy-in. Once we've concluded that process, which I envision is probably about 90 days or so, we would start a public hearing process, take this to Planning Commission, just like we do any text amendment. They would make a recommendation and forward it on to City Council for your all's review.
Aaron, give an example of who you mean by community stakeholders.
Sure. So some of the community stakeholders, reaching out to the Realtors Association, the Chamber of Commerce, trying to get maybe a few businesses to volunteer to be part of this collaborative process, the Medical Center, Shenandoah University, and so forth.
Hey, Aaron, one thing that you should do in that, I know when we talked about this last time, some of the folks from Handy Mart had mentioned like Dunkin' Donuts, when they do promotions, like they're telling them they have to put some of those things up. So I don't know if those are the types of folks as well that you might want to with that user group.
Well, I'll stress that with some of the people who try to.
Perfect. Thanks.
So overall, anticipate a tentative timeline, roughly June, this coming summer, that this process would lead to. That could be a little bit longer just depending on some of the public input and or deliberation as it happens through the public review process. But that's kind of the general background of what we're looking to go. Again, the draft ordinance is included within your materials. I won't dive into all the details here today. I'll be glad to answer any questions that you all have.
Tony,
Yes.
fill us in.
Well, I reviewed the draft ordinance that he prepared briefly. Aaron did sit in on some of the ad hoc sign committee teleconferences that we had. We were fortunate enough to have a guy named Adam Melita. He was a senior deputy in Norfolk who just went through the Central Radio case. It's a case that kind of followed up after Reed versus Town of Gilbert. It's been another fairly sign ordinance world, and he had quite a bit of input. But in any event, Aaron's draft, for the most part, mirrors the LGA's model sign ordinance. It's not a one-size-fits-all, so there are some things that need to be tweaked a little bit. But he highlighted them. You know, when I reviewed them, and he was right on in terms of what he was going to have to address before it's presented to you guys in a formal presentation. But he's pretty close.
Thanks, Aaron. Hey, great job.
Just needing
Look, it was a question.
Sure.
No. Question. Aaron, I know you're talking about signs. Let's suppose a business wants to use declaration of some sort on windows. Would that cover under signs in some way, or because they're blocking? Let's say they're blocking the view. Would that be covered in here or not? Or does it matter?
Good question. I won't take this on for our legal counsel about now.
So what are you asking?
Decoration, you know, there are a couple of businesses, right, might be Christmas decorations, or sometimes permanent with, some businesses have lights or just all kinds of things.